Today, survival means apps, batteries, and emergency kits still wrapped in plastic. But in 1942, survival meant sealing window cracks with oilcloth and boiling rainwater in fuel drums to drink the next day. It meant digging vegetable clamps into frozen ground, scavenging metal tins for tripwire alarms, and brushing teeth with fire ash. Not because it was trendy, but because there was no other choice. These methods weren't passed down. They were buried under decades of convenience. Now only fragments remain, scattered in memoirs, forgotten manuals, and fading memories of those who outlived the chaos. Hit like before we start. If you value real survival wisdom, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. Number 1. Boiled water storage in oil drums. When the water stopped, everything else followed. Without warning, taps ran dry, hand pumps slowed to a trickle, and barrels that once held reserves stood empty under dust. In wartime cities, bombings didn't just take lives. They crippled the infrastructure that kept life going. Clean water became a rare commodity, and with it came a new threat: disease. To fight back, civilians turned to one of the few dependable methods available: boiling and storing water in salvaged steel oil drums. These drums, usually discarded by factories or fuel depots, were stripped of their toxic pasta with sand, ash, and boiling rinse cycles. Once cleaned to the best of their ability, they became the centerpiece of a survival setup built entirely from scratch. Rainwater was collected from rooftops using gutter systems patched together with tin and cloth. Melted snow, filtered river water, or even puddles were strained through fabric, then poured into the drum. Over a fire built from scrap wood and coal fragments, the water was boiled hard, not simmered, and left to cool naturally. Once cooled, the lid was tightened using wax, cloth, or even rope soaked in grease. The goal wasn't elegance, it was isolated. Stored properly, this boiled water could last several days without turning, giving families a margin of safety in a city where hospitals overflowed and sanitation had collapsed. Many placed these drums in underground cellars or half-buried them in shaded corners of yards to protect them from heat, scavengers, or air raids. Others wrapped them in cloth or straw to maintain cooler temperatures. But the process had its faults. Cleaning old fuel drums was not foolproof. Even trace residues could leach into the water. Firewood was hard to come by, especially during winter or curfews, and the act of collecting it put civilians at constant risk. Some tried burning furniture or old books, anything to keep the fire going long enough to boil. And still, they carried on. Because a full barrel meant more than hydration. It meant survival under siege. It meant washing wounds, boiling rice, brushing teeth. It meant the family wouldn't have to risk a walk to the nearest broken hydrant or beg for water from strangers. In the harsh logic of wartime, a scorched metal drum filled with clean water was worth more than gold. If you'd rely on nothing but steel and fire to stay alive, subscribe for more forgotten methods. Number 2. Underground vegetable clamps. When refrigeration failed and supply lines fractured, preservation became a battle of inches and temperature. With winter creeping in and electricity unreliable or entirely gone, civilians turned to the soil itself, not to grow, but to protect. They built vegetable clamps, insulated underground storage mounds designed to keep root crops fresh for months without rot or freezing. The concept was deceptively simple yet astonishingly effective. A shallow pit was dug into dry, well-drained earth. The bottom was layered with straw or dry grass to absorb moisture. On top of this, root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and beets were carefully arranged in layers, each one cushioned by more straw. The entire pile was then mounted over with soil, thick enough to block frost, but porous enough to let trapped heat and moisture escape. In wet climates, some even built the clamp into a slope, or added a central ventilation pipe made from old tin or bamboo to prevent condensation and rot. These clamps were not random piles. They were engineered with precision. Families often mapped out locations facing away from prevailing winds, or near hedgerows for natural shelter. Some lined the walls with reclaimed bricks or wood scraps for added stability. The key was regulating temperature without intervention. The earth's insulation slowed freezing, and the straw wicked away the kind of dampness that destroyed food stores. In many cases, clamps preserved vegetables deep into the hunger months, February, March, long after any ration line had dried up. This made them a strategic asset. In rural areas, they allowed farmers to stockpile beyond what ration books permitted. In cities, families who had access to even a small yard could preserve harvests from black market trades, rooftop gardens, or countryside relatives. But this method came with strict rules. Timing mattered. If vegetables were clamped too soon, they could sweat and spoil. If the mound wasn't built high enough, frost crept in from the surface. And animals, rats, badgers, even desperate humans, posed a constant threat. Some buried nails or glass shards around their clamps. Others sat guard with makeshift tools at night. And yet this quiet technology endured. It required no metal, no fuel, no electricity, just patience, discipline, and the will to outlast the cold. In the heart of a broken world, beneath the crust of winter soil, civilians hid their hope one root at a time. Number 3. Stale bread. Regrinding bread was sacred. Not because it tasted good, but because it was rare, rationed, and never guaranteed. When flour shipments slowed and bakeries shuttered under blackout orders, civilians stretched every crumb until it could be stretched no more. But bread doesn't last. Within days it hardened. Within a week it molded. And in cities where rationing reduced families to ounces per person, waste was unforgivable. So they adapted. Stale bread was not discarded. It was reborn. Dried slowly near stoves or heaters until it turned brittle, the hardened loaves were crushed back into coarse meal using rolling pins, stones, or meat grinders. This regrinded bread flour was then reused as filler in stews, pancake batter, or even mixed with new flour to extend a loaf. This was not soft or palatable food. It was dense, bitter, and coarse. But it delivered calories, and in wartime, that was the only metric that mattered. Housewives collected every heel, every crust, storing them in cloth sacks or old tins until they had enough to justify a batch. Some even combined the ground bread with powdered milk, dried herbs, or bone broth to disguise the flavor. The regrinding method had ancient roots, but in the context of World War II, it resurfaced with brutal necessity. Civilians used flat stones or improvised mills made from bicycle gears and scrap metal to grind bread into particles fine enough for reuse. In some towns, cooperative grinding stations emerged, shared setups where families took turns processing their stale bread, often in return for a portion of the output. The limits of the method were clear. Mold was the enemy. Once a loaf turned green, it couldn't be salvaged. And drying bread too fast near open flames often led to scorching, which made it unusable. Grinding was labor-intensive, messy, and slow, especially without proper tools. The flour it produced lacked gluten strength, making it poorly suited for baking unless mixed with other grains. But these weren't barriers. They were challenges. Civilians overcame them because they had to. There was no alternative but hunger. And so, loaves once dismissed as stale became tomorrow's meal. The process required no currency, no fuel, no imports. Just a stove, time, and the discipline to treat even the inedible as valuable. In homes where nothing was wasted, stale bread was never the end, only the beginning of another way to survive. Number 4. Tin can signal alarms. When night fell, danger didn't sleep. It moved silently, through alleys, across fields, over broken fences. In war-torn towns and ration-starved countryside, the threat wasn't always soldiers. It was the desperate, looters, thieves, even starving neighbors. With food hidden in gardens, tools buried near sheds, and supplies tucked beneath floorboards, civilians needed a way to protect what little they had. Locks were scarce. Electricity is unreliable. Alarms are impossible. So they turned to scrap and built their own warning systems using nothing but string and discarded tin cans. These makeshift tripwire alarms became the first line of defense against intrusion. The method was straightforward but effective. Several empty tin cans were punched with holes and threaded together using wire, twine, or salvage string. These clusters were then hung loosely between stakes, fence posts, or nailed across door frames. A length of cord was stretched low across potential entry points, barely visible in the dark. If someone moved through the area unaware, their foot would trigger the line, sending the cans crashing together with a sharp metallic rattle loud enough to wake a sleeping household or startle the intruder into fleeing. For families guarding hidden gardens, stored coal, or ration tins kept outside to stay cool, this noise often meant the difference between loss and survival. Civilians adapted the method to their environments. Some lined the cans with small rocks or broken glass shards to amplify sound. Others suspended them from tree limbs, so even a slight breeze wouldn't give away their position. In urban areas, stairwells, alleyways, and window grates were rigged with similar setups, using bottle caps, iron scraps, or anything that clattered loud and fast. The design wasn't meant to stop anyone. It was meant to alert, to give a few seconds of warning in a world where seconds mattered. Yet the system wasn't flawless. Wind could trigger false alarms. Rain softened cords and rusted the cans. Animals, rats, cats, even stray dogs, sometimes tripped the wires and caused panic. But these were known risks, accepted with the full weight of necessity. In many households, nightly patrols checked each line before bed, tightening strings, repositioning cans, resetting broken connections. Children were taught to recognize the sound. Adults slept with boots beside them ready to move if the clatter came. Tin can alarms weren't modern, secure, or advanced, but they worked. And in that darkness, when resources were scarce and trust even scarcer, that sound was more than metal. It was protection. If survival meant building your alarm system from trash, would you know how? Subscribe for more wartime resource tactics. Number 5, communal soup kitchens. When individual kitchens went cold, communities lit fires together. In bombed-out neighborhoods and ration-choked cities, survival no longer hinged on personal stockpiles. It depended on collective effort. Communal soup kitchens emerged not as charity, but as infrastructure, and set up in church basements, schoolyards, or makeshift tents near rubble. These kitchens became essential feeding stations for those with no fuel, no food, and no functioning stove. Families contributed what little they had. Wilted cabbage, marrow bones, scraps of barley, even weeds like nettles or wild garlic. Volunteers, often women, sometimes former cooks or factory workers, transformed these fragments into nourishment that could stretch across dozens of mouths. Ration books didn't cover generosity, but communal kitchens operated beyond official channels, often supported by local councils or quietly aided by sympathetic shopkeepers. Their strength was in scale. Cooking in bulk conserved fuel. A single roaring pot could feed 50. Ashes were saved, water reused, and utensils shared. The soup was rarely thick, never rich, and often the same day after day. But it was warm, it was real. And in neighborhoods where children collapsed from hunger and elders burned furniture for heat, a hot cup of broth was everything. Strict systems kept order. Queues were long but disciplined. Each person brought their own tin or bowl, often marked with initials to prevent disputes. In freezing conditions, civilians stood silently for their share. No shouting, no pushing, just the solemn ritual of waiting. Every drop mattered. Wastage was a crime, not by law, but by conscience. Those who helped cook sometimes ate last. In rural areas, mobile soup kitchens were mounted on carts or trucks and moved between villages. In cities, they became gathering points, not just for food, but for information, morale, and momentary peace. Yet even this model strained under scarcity. There were days when nothing came in, when donations dried up or raids made movement impossible, when pots boiled only water, because that's all there was, but the kitchens endured. Because they were more than kitchens, they were a rejection of isolation. A statement that even in collapse, some form of society remained. That hunger could be met not just with rations, but with resolve. If survival meant feeding your neighbor before yourself, could you do it? Tell me. Comment section. Number 6, ash-based tooth cleaning. Cleanliness wasn't cosmetic, it was survival. In a world where hospitals overflowed and antibiotics were scarce, even a simple tooth infection could spiral into something far worse. But toothpaste was a luxury few could afford or even find during wartime. Imports were halted. Factories were converted for military production. Shelves stayed empty for months. So civilians turned to an ancient remedy buried in the hearth: wood ash. Specifically, fine ash sifted from hardwood fires. Dry, alkaline, and mildly abrasive. It wasn't pleasant, it didn't taste good, but it worked. Every morning, across kitchens and bomb shelters, people dipped damp fingers or rags into small tins of cooled ash and scrubbed their teeth in silence. The method served multiple functions. Ash removed plaque by abrasion, neutralized some acidity, and helped reduce bacterial buildup in the mouth. It left a chalky film, but preserved oral hygiene in an era when dental care was all but inaccessible. In rural areas, civilians collected ash directly from cooking fires. In urban zones, they bartered for it. A tin of clean ash traded for buttons, sewing needles, or dried herbs. Some added a pinch of salt or crushed mint leaves if available, trying to offset the bitterness. Others mixed ash with a drop of water or animal fat to create a crude paste. But the process wasn't without caution. Ash from treated wood, coal, or painted materials was dangerous. Only pure wood ash, white, soft, and powdery, was considered safe. Children were taught early how to identify it, how to store it in sealed containers, and how to avoid the toxic types. Teeth were scrubbed gently to avoid damaging enamel. A small cloth or a whittled stick served as a toothbrush. In some households, the routine became sacred. One of the few things civilians could still control in a world collapsing around them. It wasn't vanity, it was discipline. An untreated abscess could mean weeks of agony. A rotting tooth could lead to infection, fever, and, in extreme cases, death. There were no spare dentists, no spare medicine, only prevention. Ash cleaning became a daily ritual. Not because it was effective by modern standards, but because it was better than nothing. It meant resilience, order, and the will to endure with dignity. Could you face a world with no toothpaste, no dentist, and no margin for decay? Number 7, oilcloth window seals. When the sirens stopped and night fell, darkness wasn't a choice. It was law. Light could mean death. Enemy bombers hunted glimmers, and even a candle's flicker might draw fire. To survive, civilians had to erase their homes from view. Curtains weren't enough. Paper warped and damp, boards left gaps. So they turned to a material both humble and powerful: oilcloth. Heavy fabric soaked in linseed oil, wax, or animal fat. Oilcloth was cut and nailed across window frames to block every trace of light. It formed a seal, flexible, waterproof, and tight against wind. Not just for blackout orders, but to preserve warmth and security when both were in short supply. Oilcloth had been used for centuries. On tables, in kitchens, for waterproofing coats. During the war, its role shifted. It became insulation. Civilians stitched together scraps from old raincoats, aprons, or tarp remnants. Some treated their own cloth at home, brushing it with oil mixtures and drying it over stoves. Once fastened to window frames, oilcloth didn't crack in cold or curl with damp. It clung. Families reinforced edges with tacks or nailed wooden strips along the frame. In winter, it held back freezing drafts. During raids, it ensured no glow betrayed the life behind it. Yet it was far from perfect. Oilcloth was hard to come by, and the oil used to make it was often rationed. Improvisation filled the gap. Flour sacks were oiled. Bed linens were boiled in fat. In some homes, these seals were doubled. Oilcloth inside, blankets outside. It took time and effort, but the payoff was critical. Rooms stayed darker, quieter, warmer. In cities where entire blocks lost heating, a well-sealed window could keep a single room livable. And in places hit hard by nightly raids, it meant obeying blackout regulations without constant fear of punishment or worse. Every evening, these windows were checked, edges pressed, seals retired, corners secured. Children were taught to walk in the dark, to navigate hallways by feel, never touching a switch. The oilcloth didn't just block light, it forced a new way of living, contained, disciplined, invisible. And when dawn finally came, the fabric was peeled back, slowly, revealing not just the outside world, but the resilience that had endured inside. If survival meant sealing your world in silence and shadow, would you be ready? Subscribe to keep these hard-won methods alive. They didn't call themselves preppers. They had no gear, no stockpiles, no internet guides. Just instinct, discipline, and whatever their hands could salvage. In a world cracked open by war, civilians found ways to survive without power, without safety, and often without hope. They didn't ask for convenience. They asked for another day. And they earned it. One boiled drum, one sealed window, one shared meal at a time. These methods weren't designed in labs. They were built in ruins, tested in cold, proven by hunger. Today we forget them not because they failed, but because we've grown too comfortable to remember. But comfort is fragile, and when it slips, only what's remembered will remain. If these lessons still matter, I'd hold on to them and subscribe so they're never forgotten again.